Understanding America's presidential election process is incredibly complicated, and that's on purpose. It makes it so that the powers that be are able to maneuver things in ways that they see fit in order to supposedly suppress the will of the people and the voters. But that's not entirely the case, actually. It's more due to the fact that here in the United States, we have a very decentralized form of voting that our founders essentially created, which is made even more complicated by the fact that we have a large two-party apparatus, the Republican and Democratic parties, that have huge influence over how these elections are held. So today, I'm just going to walk you through some of those examples, and hopefully by the end of it, you'll have a good idea of how our election process works. And this is all going to be very timely because come this week is the last, hopefully, big primary for the Republican Party between Donald Trump and Nikki Haley in South Carolina. So let's take a step back. And guys, obviously, if you're not following my channel already, you should be. Make sure to subscribe, like the video, share it with your friends, because I doubt most of them also understand how our election process here in America works. And of course, if you're not from America, just like Putin said, who also said our election process is very complicated, hopefully this will give you a good background, a good idea of how this stuff works. So obviously in the political process, you have various candidates who are running against each other, and you have what are called primaries. Primaries are obviously when Republicans need to be running against each other to see who the Republican nominee is going to be, and same for the Democratic side. But this election year here in 2024 has shown just how intricate the system works and how complicated it can be. So we're going to start with the first primary for the Republicans, at least, which was Iowa. So here's the first thing you need to know. There are primaries and there are caucuses. What's the difference? A primary is what most people are familiar with, where you simply just go to your election site, normally a local school or a local church, and vote via pen and ballot of who you want to be the primary winner. And then those votes are counted up, and then supposedly, in a complicated manner, the person who gets the most of those votes is awarded the winner of that primary. But caucuses are slightly different. The way the Iowa caucus works and other caucuses work is that actually a bunch of people get together in a room and through vocal support have different candidates, surrogates debating in those rooms about why people should choose to award those people those delegates. It's actually a very active way of voting in a primary or voting for whoever the next party is going to be, the next party candidate for the next presidential election, because you have all these people in the room deciding right then and there who they should award the delegates to. And it's very active because a lot of times the votes are just taken on by voice. And so in Iowa, you have different groups of people essentially saying, okay, well, the majority of the people in this room have said yay, for example, Donald Trump. And so we are going to award our delegates to Donald Trump in this caucus. But where it gets even more complicated is different states can determine how those candidates, how those electoral votes, how those people are awarded to the primary candidate. Sometimes it's proportional, which means if you get 70% of the vote, you get 70% of those delegates. But sometimes it's not. And sometimes it's a winner-take-all scenario where if you get over 51% of the delegates in that primary or caucus allocated to you, then you get the whole bunch of delegates. So it's a winner-take-all strategy. Iowa was proportional, which is why you had both Nikki Haley and the other third candidate, who is now Ron DeSantis, get some delegates from the Iowa primary because it was proportional. It was a proportional caucus, an Iowa caucus. See, even it's hard to tell because I keep confusing the terms primary and caucus. But Iowa was a caucus. So then we go down to, on the Democratic side, we kind of learn a lesson about the strength of the party. So let me back up. So that is the big difference between a caucus and a primary. And the Iowa caucus is what Iowa had. And that was how voters were actually deciding who the primary candidate was going to be, was through essentially enclosed room meetings with different power players shouting who they wanted to vote for until everyone came to a consensus. Now, on the Democratic side, it's actually very interesting. It's mostly the same, but here's where it gets fascinating. Here's where we learn about the dynamics between the party itself and the state. So the state is the one that is supposed to determine when the primary or the caucus is held. And so each state legislature says, because it takes state resources to host these, what date in the year they are going to be holding their primary or their caucus for their respective parties. The DNC and the RNC give those states essentially a schedule and say, your state is allowed, or your state's party is allowed to schedule elections during this time of year. And so, for example, for the RNC, they said all states must make their primary elections or their caucuses after March 6th, except for Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina and Nevada. And that's how they ensure those are the first 3 to 4 states to have their primaries or caucuses held to kind of garner influence. But you can have circumstances like with the DNC where that's upended. So traditionally with the DNC, New Hampshire is the first primary state. And that's how it's been for a very long time. And so the New Hampshire legislator has it in their legislation that New Hampshire is always going to be the first state in the primary process for the DNC. But this got complicated because at the time, about 6 months ago, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was actually leading in New Hampshire, and the DNC did not want that. So they moved in a historic decision to have the first primary state not be New Hampshire, but to be South Carolina. But New Hampshire had their primary anyway. So what does that mean? Well, the DNC said that New Hampshire was going to be sanctioned, going to be punished for doing this. And so the New Hampshire primary, even though Biden won, does not get any delegates awarded to the DNC's national convention, at least for now when I'm making this video. The DNC can change that since RFK Jr. is no longer a member of the Democratic Party, so he wasn't on the list. But that shows you the dynamic. So the DNC can essentially take any state's delegates and say, well, you disobeyed party rules, so your delegates no longer count. So that's exactly what happened. And currently, if you voted in the New Hampshire primary, and if you voted for Biden, as of right now, those delegates do not matter because the DNC is punishing New Hampshire for hosting the election anyway. This happened with Republicans in Nevada. A lot of people may wonder, why were there 2 elections held in Nevada? And this is where the difference between the state as an authority and the party as an authority really become known. So the party in Nevada that is currently under control, or the party that currently controls the Nevada state legislature, is the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party decided that in Nevada, they were going to just be hosting an overall primary, and they changed the date and the way the election was hosted. The Republican National Convention and the Republican Party of Nevada did not agree with these rule changes. So by law, the Nevada state has a date in which they're going to be hosting their primary elections. But the RNC and the Republican Party of Nevada have stated, well, we're just not going to obey state law and do our own thing. And the RNC is not recognizing the Nevada state primary. So that's why you had 2 elections. You had one approved by the RNC and the Republican Party of Nevada, in which Trump was on the ballot. But Nikki Haley only registered for the state primary. And so that is why Nikki Haley was on one ballot for the state primary and Trump was not. And funny enough, Nikki Haley still lost to none of the above in that state primary, as opposed to the Nevada RNC caucus, which only had Trump. Well, it had Trump and a few others on the ballot, actually, but Trump won handily. So then the Nevada delegates were awarded to Trump. This process is really interesting because the parties themselves are not in the Constitution. They are parallel government organizations. They're parallel systems. So the RNC and the DNC working with states, hopefully in conjunction with one another, organize our electoral processes. But when states start to not do what either big party wants, the big party processes can actually affect what those states are able to do. That gets really interesting because if there are unfavorable candidates from a certain state, or a certain state is disobeying what the RNC or the DNC want, they can simply change the rules in the system to negate what that state wants. In Georgia, Georgia was trying to have an earlier Democratic primary for the Democratic Party. And the Georgia Democratic Party wanted this. But the Georgia legislature is controlled by Republicans, and the Republicans decided they were not going to allow Georgia to change the date in which the primary was held. So it looks like the DNC simply just did not allow the Democratic Party of Georgia to host its own kind of primary, much like with the example in Nevada, where the RNC simply said, you know what, forget what the state wants, we're doing our own thing. Another layer of complexity comes from how the delegates are awarded in each state. In some states, you have a winner-take-all system, which we briefly went over, where whoever just simply wins the majority gets all the delegates for the state. But you can also have processes where it simply is a proportional vote. Whereas if you get 70% of the total vote count, you get 70% of the delegates. And then you kind of have an in-between where you can have a winner-take-all at a local level, where all of the delegates from a local area go to whoever got 51% or more of the vote count. But then that means that if in another area a competing candidate gets 51% or more, they will get all of their delegates, to the point where it becomes kind of proportional, but not completely. And the state, once again, controls that. So this leads us up to the South Carolina primary, which is the third big, or actually the fourth big primary for the RNC, the Republicans. Now, the Democrats have already had the South Carolina primary. It was the first one for them. Biden won handily. For the Republicans, it's looking to be Trump versus Haley. And so far, it looks like Trump will just do quite fine. However, South Carolina has an open primary process. So what does that mean? An open primary process means that anyone, regardless of party, can vote in the primary once. That means if you're a Democrat, you can vote for a Republican in the South Carolina primary. So what the South Carolina primary shows us is that even within the electoral process, you have different forms of primary, and some of them are closed primaries. A closed primary is when only members of the party can vote, which means if you're independent, you're not allowed to vote for either Democrat or Republican, which is why a lot of people in America purposefully register as Republican or Democrat, because even if you are independent and don't align with either party, you often want a choice in the primary process, because as an independent, you don't necessarily get that voice vote. And so our electoral process here in the United States is very decentralized. It's run by the state, but it's also run in a parallel way by the party. That means that in the state of Florida will determine when our primary is held, but they do that with the work of the RNC, the Republican National Committee, and the Republican Party of Florida, as well as with the DNC and the Democratic Party of Florida. And if there is any disagreement along there, it can have big consequences. Theoretically speaking, if Florida goes rogue and decides that, well, we just want to host something completely different, the RNC can say, okay, well, all the delegates from Florida no longer count in the delegates awarded to whoever is going to be the Republican primary's main presidential candidate. The DNC can do the exact same thing, much like they did in New Hampshire. So when you span out, our electoral process, at least when it comes to elections, is heavily reliant upon state infrastructure, but then also the party infrastructure, Republican and Democratic parties. The big question to ask is this a good thing or is it a bad thing? Is it a good thing that we have these quasi-governmental systems that have so much power over our election process, like the RNC and the DNC? And both the RNC and DNC can change their rules. And in the case of the DNC, you will see a lot of conversations about replacing Biden. Well, after the elections happen, even if Biden, when he wins the primary election process, if Biden were to drop out and simply say, well, I am no longer running, the DNC will simply coalesce and choose who their next candidate is going to be, which could be Biden's plan all along, or which could be the Democratic plan all along, is let Biden win every vote in the primary process and then choose whoever Biden's successor will be once the DNC is holding its convention. That way, the DNC itself and the powers that be could easily control whoever the next Democratic nominee is going to be running for president. They wouldn't have to leave it up to the will of the people or go through another primary process. They could simply pick and choose. And this would be the same for the RNC. If Trump does end up going to jail, then the RNC at their national convention could simply elect who they believe is going to be the best fit for the next president to represent the Republican Party. And they could end up still choosing Donald Trump, and he could end up running from prison and even winning an election from prison, right? But this shows you in the end that America's system is incredibly complicated. And it's a lot of times why a lot of people don't really understand how it works. And that benefits the people in power because it means they can maneuver and change things as they see fit. And we, the American people, really don't know what's going on because there's so much information, not just from the local rules that your local state party might have, but then the national party itself, all down to the state legislature and the moves that are being made there. Hopefully, this video gives you a better idea of how complicated and complex America's electoral process is, how there are organizations that are not a part of our government that have a lot of influence over the electoral process, and how you can see differences and sometimes mishaps like 2 elections in Nevada or rogue elections in New Hampshire that end up not counting. Thanks again for watching the video, guys. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and share this with your friends.